Prabhupada ki. Jai. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhara, Shri Vasari Govinda ki. Jai. Radha Krishna Go Gopinath Shanta, Giri Govardhana ki. Vrindavana Dhamma ki. Mayapur Navadru Dhamma ki. Ayodhya Dhamma ki. Dwarka Dhamma ki. Jagannath Puri Dhamma ki. Eka Chakra Dhamma ki. Ganga Mai ki. Yamuna Mai ki. Tulsi Devi ki. Bhakti Devi ki. Transcendental Book Distribution. Harinama Sankirtan. Transcendental Prasad Distribution ki. Samveda Bhaktivinoda ki. Gaur Prema. Glorious to some of us.
Hare Krishna.
Glorious to some of us.
Hare Krishna.
Glorious to some of us.
Hare Krishna.
Glorious to Shri Shri Guru.
Glorious to Guru. All glories to Prabhupada. All glories to Prabhupada. So there's the yesterday was the Kali today, so we have to break the fast. So this is like prasad from Jagannath Puri Maharaj. We would also like to distribute the prasad to the devotees.
Okay.
So everyone come take prasad from Maharaj's lotus hands.
Yeah.
Oh, done.
Take it from his hands.
Break it up.
Take it again.
No problem.
Come on, Maharaj.
Cookie thing.
Don't be afraid. Come.
Maharaj is very much for the only chocolate machine.
Yeah. Oh, nice. We almost did it there.
Shri Prabhu, you took Prabhuji? Mine is also two devotees downstairs, so if you could break it up. Yeah, break it up now. If you don't mind, if you give me.
Okay.
I'll go give them.
Okay.
Honorable is coming now. Or you can give.
Now that's the official one.
Would you like to sit, Mark, on the chair?
Station on the.
Would you like chair or you like sit on the floor?
No, I can sit on the. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Bharadhari Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Bharadhari Jai Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Bharadhari Jai Gopi Jana Vallabha Giri Bharadhari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachahari Yamunatira Vanachahari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna Hare Krishna Hare Hare Rama
Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada
Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada
Jaya Om Vishnupada Brahmansa Paranikacharya Śrīmad Bhāgavatam A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki
Jaya
Koti Vaishnava Ki Granthraj Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam Ki Salameda Bhaktivedanta Ki Four Premanandi All glory to some Ki All glory to some All glory to some All glory to Shri Shri and Shri Guru-puja. So I understand that you're on Canto 1, Chapter 3, Text 14, is that correct?
Yes. Correct.
Okay. Oh, boy, please set my basis. Rishibir Yachito Beye Rishibir Yachito Bheje Navamam Partivam Vapu Navamam Partivam Vapu Dugde Mam Oshadir Vipras Dugde Mam Oshadir Vipras Tenayam Sa Usattamaha
Tenayam Sa Usattamaha
Tenayam Sa Usattamaha
Tenayam Sa Usattamaha
Rishibhir Yachito Bheje
Rishibhir Yachito Bheje
Navamam Partivam Vapu
Navamam Partivam Vapu
Dugde Mam Oshadir Vipras
Hemam Oshadir Vipras
Tenayam Sa Usattamaha
Tenayam Sa Usattamaha
Rishibhir Yachito PJ
Rishibhir Yachito Bheje
Navanam Parthivim Yapu
Navamam Partivam Vapu
Durgaman Osadir Vipras
Dugde Mam Oshadir Vipras
Enayam Sa Usattama
Tenayam Sa Usattamaha
Rishibhir Yachito PJ
Rishibhir Yachito Bheje
Navamam Partivam Vapu
Navamam Partivam Vapu
Vidyamam Oshadhi Vipras
Dudhemam Oshadhir Vipras
Denayam Sa Shaktama
Vinayam Samsalatama
Rishibhir Yachito Bheje
Rishibhir Yachito Bheje
Navamam Partivam Vapu
Navamam Partivam Vapu
Dudhemam Ashadhi Vipras
Dudhemam Oshadhir Vipras
Denayam Sattamaha
Vinayam Samsalatama
Ishibhi Yashito Bheje
Rishibhir Yachito Bheje
Dhavanam Partibam Vapuhu
Navamam Partivam Vapu
Dudhemam Oshadhir Vipras
Dudhemam Oshadhir Vipras
Hinayam Sa Usattama
Vinayam Samsalatama Rishibhi
Ishibhi
by the sages. Yachitaha being prayed for. Bheje accepted. Navamam the ninth one. Partivam the ruler of the earth. Vapuhu body. Dugdha milking. Imam all these. Oshadihi products of the earth. Vipraha Brahman. Tena by. Ayam this. Saha he. Ushattamaha beautifully attractive. The translation reads, O Brahmanas, in the ninth incarnation, the Lord, prayed for by the sages, accepted the body of a king, Purtu, who cultivated the land to yield various produces, and for that reason the earth was beautiful and attractive. I say, you all please repeat, O Brahmanas, in the ninth incarnation, the Lord prayed for by the sages, accepted the body of a king, Prithu, who cultivated the land to yield various produces. And for that reason, the earth was beautiful and attractive. So the purport reads, before the advent of King Prithu, there was a great havoc of maladministration through the vicious life of the previous king, the father of Maharaj Prithu. The intelligent class of men, namely sages and brahmanas, not only prayed for the Lord to come down, but also dethrone the previous king. It is the duty of the king to be pious, and thus look after the all-round welfare of the citizens. Whenever there is some negligence on part of the king in discharging his duty, the intelligent class of men must dethrone him. The intelligent class of men, however, do not occupy the royal throne because they have much more important duties for the welfare of the public. Instead of occupying the royal throne, they prayed for the incarnation of the Lord, and the Lord came as Maharaj Prithu. Real intelligent men or qualified brahmanas never aspire for political posts. Maharaj Prithu excavated many produces from the earth, and thus not only did the citizens become happy to have such a good king, but the complete sight of the earth also became beautiful and attractive. Shibir Yachito Bheje Navalam Partivam Vapu Dugdhemam Oshadir Vipras Tenayam Sa Ushattamaha. O Brahmanas, in the ninth incarnation, the Lord prayed for by the sages, accepted the body of a king, Prithu, who cultivated the land to yield various produces, and for that reason the earth was beautiful and attractive. So this is the third chapter, the source of all incarnations. this chapter, we will gradually work our way up to the 19th and 20th incarnations, which will be listed as Krishna and Balaram. And then about a handful of verses later, we'll hear Ete Chamasa Pumsam Krishnas to Bhagavan Swayam Indrari Vyakalam Lokam Hridayanta Yuge Yuge. That the previous incarnations are either portions or portions of plenary portions, but Krishna is Swayam Bhagavan, the Supreme Lord, directly. So it's said that we have many, as are described, amsas, which are full plenary expansions of the Supreme Lord, and we have kalas, which are portions of plenary portions. And then we have aveshas, which are separate incarnations, and we have especially empowered aveshas, which are called Shakti aveshas. And so there are various categories of incarnation. And in this list, some 22, 24, depends on how you count, various incarnations are given. And then we find that Krishna is the Supreme in his original form. And he comes, of course, the end of the 28th millennium, at the Dwapara Yuga, at the end of the 28th millennium of the 7th Manvantara, every day of Brahma. So this is the 9th incarnation, Navamam. So the 9th incarnation is Maharaj Prithu. And this story of Prithu is described very copiously in the 4th canto of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, starting with the 14th chapter, going all the way up to the 19th or 20th chapter. So it stretches out over a huge portion of the Bhagavatam. And we learn there that Maharaj Venu was a very vicious king. That he was the son of Maharaj Anga and Sunita. So Maharaj Anga had desired a son, but was unable to get a son. Some sinful activity that he committed in a previous lifetime had made it very difficult for Maharaj Anga to have a son. But the sages suggested that he perform a particular sacrifice. I think it was a Pumsavana sacrifice. And after having performed the Pumsavana sacrifice, some sweet rice was produced. And Maharaj Anga immediately offered the sweet rice to his wife. Although technically he should not have done so, because his wife was not qualified. Now, why was she not qualified? Evidently, Sunita had performed some mischief. From what I understand, Maharaj Anga married Sunita, and she was the daughter of death personified. Whether that's the same as Yamaraj or not, it seems like it's described that she's the daughter of Yamaraj. But she was very capricious and disturbing. And there was a sage who was in the forest, and his name was Sushanka, and he was performing various meditation and yajna in the forest. And this Sunita, she disturbed him. She used to try to annoy him in various ways. And one time, he didn't pay any attention to her. Sometimes he would say, "Get out of here, leave me alone." But that's as far as he would go. He would never actually go any further than that. He just saw her as an annoyance. And one time, she went so far as to hit him with a stick. And still, he just told her to leave. But later, she got even more bold, and one time she struck him with a whip. And at this point, the sage had enough, so he stood up and he cursed Sunita that you are like behaving like a very low-class person, and therefore you will have a child who will be totally uncontrolled and will create problems all over the world. So he cursed her in this way that would happen. Of course, this would later be her son, Vena. And our Maharaj Anga was desperate to have a son. So when he gave the sweet rice to Sunita, she certainly did give birth to a son, but that son was very vicious. And Anga would just kill animals because he liked to see animals die. He had friends that he would play with, and in the course of playing with them, he would kill them, like he would kill animals. Later, when he got a little older, he was totally uncontrolled, and he would do all kinds of vicious things. And Maharaj Anga tried to correct him, but he was unable to do so. And finally, Maharaj Anga could understand that the Supreme Lord had benedicted him because he wanted a son with a bad son, because he knew that would detach him from family life. And so Maharaj Anga said that if one has a good son, then the kingdom goes well and one is satisfied in family life, but one gets attached. But if one has a bad son, then one becomes disgusted with family life and leaves and goes to the forest, which is what Maharaj Anga did. He, in the middle of the night, disappeared and left the forest, and therefore the kingdom was left with nobody in charge. So the sages noticed that because there was nobody in charge of the kingdom, dacoits were running amok, and everything was becoming very difficult. So the sages thought, well, we have a king, Vena, we should install him on the throne. So they coronated Vena, and in a short while later on, Vena created all kinds of problems in the kingdom. He outlawed sacrifices, and he created various difficulties for various sages. And so the sages began to see that this Maharaj Vena was more of a menace than he was a ruler. And so they decided to give him some advice. And when they met with Vena, they instructed him that, my dear king, you are the embodiment of religious processes, and you are the person who is to help the living entities in your kingdom to overcome the material desires that they have taken up for many lifetimes. And so how can you stop the sacrifices? The sacrifices are intended to please the demigods, and when the demigods are pleased, then there'll be produce and natural things in the kingdom. So please rethink your policy of stopping various sacrifices. And upon hearing that, Vena simply laughed at them and said, you all are totally unaware of the real situation, that I am the embodiment of all the demigods. I don't need to offer them any sacrifices. And rather, you all should realize that I'm the one that provides everything, and not worry about the sacrifice of demigods. Rather, you all should worship me. He was very arrogant, and he was under the false impression that he himself was the center of everything. And in this way, because of his various mischief, the sages became very angry with Vena. And as a result, they said the Sanskrit mantra, and upon chanting or incanting this Sanskrit mantra in a mood of anger, Vena immediately died. So they hummed him to death, and he was immediately dead. And his mother, Sunita, was heartbroken. Of course, it was her karma for having, caused mischief to the sage Susanka. And now her son was dead. So she had some mantras and herbs collected, and she preserved Vena's body in oil. And of course, now that Vena was dead, the citizens were no longer plagued by Vena. However, they were plagued by dacoits and various common criminals, because whenever there's no government, things become out of control. And so the citizens were, as it's described in the Bhagavatam, like ants on a log that's on fire on both ends. So there's fire on one end, fire on the other end, and the ants are in between. So this was the unfortunate plight of the citizens. As a result, the sages began to notice anomalies and difficulties, and eventually they thought, well, Vena was a bad ruler, but now the citizens are not protected by any ruler. We have to act in some kind of way. So the sages took Vena's body and they churned Vena's thighs. And the first entity that was produced from the churning of Vena's thighs, which they did in some mystical way, was a dwarfish, dark-complected creature with copper-colored hair was produced, and that entity was named Bahuka. And he became the progenitor and the first exponent of the Nishida race, which are forest-dwelling tribes. So that was not what the sages were hoping for. That was not the right person to take the rulership. So then they churned Vena's arms. And by churning Vena's arms, two entities were produced. A very powerful male who would become Prithu, and a very beautiful female who will become Archie, or Prithu's wife. And when Prithu and Archie were generated, then the sages could understand that the earth was in good hands. Because actually, the line of Anga was from Dhruva Maharaj, and it was a very pious line. So because of this, mischief of Sunita, there was this one generation, or Vena, who was not good, but actually the line was good. So the next generation, of course, was Prithu, although he was not technically, in the usual sense, the son of Vena, because he was generated from the body of Vena. Sages knew how to perform this kind of thing. He was the person who would take the throne. And the sages prayed for an incarnation of the Supreme. So Prithu is described as a Shaktavesha. So he is not the Supreme Lord in a plenary portion, or even a portion of a plenary portion, but he's a tiny living entity like you and I. However, he's given special mercy by the Lord. And in this case, his special potency is that he was able to be the embodiment of proper ruling. So when Maharaj Prithu comes of age, he's installed on the throne, and there's a great ceremony. The Sutta, Magadha, and Bandi, various poets and glorifiers, they begin to glorify Maharaj Prithu. And they tell about his future, that he will be like fire, intolerable to those who are creating problems in the kingdom, that he will milk the earth like a cow, and that he will meet Sanat Kumar of the 4 Kumaras, and that he will flatten the earth from being very mountainous to be where it's very flat, so it can be appropriately cultivated. And they describe all these various qualities of Maharaj Prithu. But with all this eulogizing, Maharaj Prithu objects. And he says, my dear Bandis and Magadas, please don't glorify me like this, because I have not actually demonstrated any of these good qualities that you are describing, at least yet. So it's better if you save your glorification for when I actually demonstrate these things. So Prithu made that proclamation, but it appears, at least from the Bhagavatam, that the suttas, the Magadas, and the Vandis paid almost no attention to it. And they went ahead and continued to glorify him in various ways. And of course, eventually it would come that he would get rid of all the dacoits and the threats to the order of the kingdom, and eventually he would discover the citizens were in difficulty. They had not very much to eat, and they were performing their yajnas very carefully, but they were starving. So they came to Maharaj Prithu, and they said, we are doing our best, but we are always beset with a lack of food. So please think over our difficulty and decide what is best to do. So Prithu thought for some time, and he became aware that actually the citizens were not doing anything wrong. They were, to the best of their ability, engaging in sacrifices. We hear this whole thing in chapter 3 of Bhagavad Gita, the whole idea of, yagya tat karma no yatra, lokayam karma bandhana, that all these, sacrifice has to be performed, and et cetera, et cetera. So they were not remiss in carrying out their duties. However, the earth was not performing. So Prithu, after some time thinking it over, realized it was the earth that was at fault. And he took his bow and arrow and began chasing the earth, who began to run away. And she took the form of a cow, understanding that he would be reluctant to fire arrows at a cow. But he chased the earth in many places. He chased her for some long time. And after finally capturing the earth, she began to offer prayers and began to explain her side of the story. She said that actually she was the earth, and she was like a boat that holds up all the living entities. And if Maharaj Prithu destroyed her, who would the living entities actually reside on? There would be no place for them to stand. They would be lost in outer space. And she said that she was also a woman, and therefore, even if she had made some problem, it was not proper for her to be killed by a person as illustrious in knowing Vedic principles as Maharaj Prithu. And she said she was also a cow, so therefore he should take pity on her. And Maharaj Prithu was not at all softened by these arguments. However, Bhumi Devi, or the earth personified in the form of a cow, then made one more further plea, saying that actually she was withholding the grains because there were demoniac and atheistic people who were misusing the grains. And that because they were misusing the grains, she was not allowing the grains to come forward and grow and produce bountiful food for the living entities. And she said that in this way, she was not being properly protected. So Maharaj Prithu could understand what was going on, and she suggested that the grains that she had been withholding were already withered and too old, so he needed to produce new grains. And she suggested a formula for how new grains could be produced. And that formula was that Prithu would be create a situation where she would be a cow and he would milk her, and the milk would be various things that the humans needed for their subsistence on the earth. So this was arranged. And just as Maharaj Prithu milked the earth and produced grains and all the necessary foodstuffs for the living entities who were starving, others took this formula and began to do a similar version of it. So the demigods, Indra, they took, I forget who it was, as a cow, and they milked Somaras. That's what they were into. The demons took Prahlad Maharaj, who was their leader, and they milked him, and they produced beer and wine. So naturally, the demons kind of interested in those substances. And various animals, the various birds produced insects so they could eat them, and the birds took Garuda and they milked Garuda, and they produced these insects, and the various other creatures produced various kinds of things. The Siddhas, they took, I forget who they took.
I think he's the best of the Siddhas.
Well, they milked this entity, and they produced various mystic potencies. And the Vidyadharas and the other sub-demigods, they produced the various siddhas, or the anima mahima, and this ability to become invisible and change your form. So all these were produced by these various entities. And so in this way, the earth became bountiful. As it says here, it became very beautiful and attractive. So Prithu became once again friendly to the earth and began to look after her nicely, and the earth produced everything necessary. And so this is actually the formula for opulence in the material world. One can do any kind of material arrangement one wants, or discover any kind of technological advancement, but that will never help the earth become bountiful, because actually tractors cannot produce grains. Tractors cannot produce it. Prabhupada puts it, you can take a tractor to the desert, and that does not mean you're going to be able to grow bountiful crops there. So we are under the impression that simply by technological means everything can be achieved, but it's not so. Even the simple growing of food cannot be done without the help of the Supreme. And by pleasing the Supreme, by pleasing Krishna, and or pleasing the demigods, that's a secondary way to do it. It's better to please Krishna. But if someone is not going to engage in directly pleasing the Supreme Lord, at least one should please demigods, and by so doing, one will see that there is whatever necessities one needs for everyday existence in the material world. So, of course, Prithu had other things that happened to him. He, met Sanat Kumar, and he performed 100 Ashvamedha yajnas, and at the last one, Indra stole the horse, and those are some more stories. So this is one of the In this case, Shaktavesha expansions of the Supreme Lord listed as the 9th one. And this is the one that's being under focus today. I'll stop there. If there are any questions or comments we can discuss. Yeah.
Maharaj, in the 4th canto, it also says that the Nishada race and basically the Africans, they come from this.
I'm not sure the Nishada race is identical with the African.
Okay.
The hair is described as copper colored and he's described as dwarfish. Prabhupada links them to the Kiratas, which are jungle dwellers of India, so whether that's the same thing or not, I don't know. A little bit not clear on whether that we can draw that equation straight across. But you have some other question you were wondering about that? Yeah.
Thank you for recounting so nicely pastimes of class. I was just thinking, as you were explaining the different pastimes, how it's explained in the 4th canto, sometimes it may sound very, mythological and fantastical. So I was just in our own teaching Krishna consciousness to others, how would you say do we just directly just lay it on somebody, this is what it is, or how do we present it is basically a question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Fortunately, the answer is about 30 minutes long, but I'll try to give a Reader's Digest version of it because I've thought very much about this issue. Oftentimes when people hear the accounts of the Vedic literature, there's a tendency to think of them as being more or less mythological, and even just saying that, mythological, harkens back to where does the word mythos come from? It comes from a period of time in Greek, intellectual development, when the Greeks had certain Greek philosophers who described, basically the demigods, the same ones that we talk about, and their various things. The Greeks had certain names for them. I've forgotten which one were Greeks and which one were Roman names, but they had basically the same demigods that we understand from the Vedic tradition. But later Greeks started to come up with explanations, and these were called logos. So at a point in the development of Western intellectual progress, there became this distinction between mythological explanations and logos, or logical explanations. And so in our modern Western culture, when you explain something in a logical and detailed way, that's considered good. When you talk about stories, that's considered bad, and that's considered mythology. But no one has ever proved, or disproved rather, that these entities existed. And it's very reasonable even to think that along with the mathematical and mechanical elements of the universe that we live in, there are some controllers as well that maybe because they are controllers and they're very powerful, they don't necessarily feel the necessity to reveal themselves to us. But it is interesting that all over the world, when you study ancient cultures, this same apparently very similar group of entities have always been discussed, whether we're talking about ancient India, or whether we're talking about Greek, Roman, or Egyptian civilization, or whether we're even talking about Polynesian civilizations or Amerindian civilizations. There's still this idea of powerful controlling beings that the ancient people of the world were convinced were a part of their everyday life. Of course, we don't see them these days, and in the Vedas we understand the reason that the demigods no longer come here is because the people of the earth have become sinful and degraded, and the demigods don't come anymore. The earth is a bad neighborhood now, so they're not so keen on coming and associating with the earth people, because the earth people are not interested in sacrifices, and that's what demigods are about. And so therefore, as a result, the demigods just let us stew in our own juices, and therefore we don't see them. Now, there are many things like this that are very difficult to show, and so they cannot be easily proven, nor can they be easily disproven either. And when we look at our world from a scientific point of view, which is the way most people do, there are many things that cannot be proven by the process of science, or even by the process of philosophy, especially modern Western philosophy. So, as I've been putting it, because we've been talking about this issue in our Monday classes, that science is very good at taking some little piece of the material, mechanistic world that we live in, and exploiting it and coming up with some, gadget, and then some industrialist takes that gadget and makes a lot of money from it. So science is very good at that. They take some detail, and after exploring that detail, they learn enough about it to craft some gadget which later on becomes mercantile, and as a result, somebody makes some money from it, like our iPhones and our internal combustion engines and our lasers, and you name it. There's so many different kinds of scientific achievements, and therefore many people assume that because there's all this detailed information about these separate categories of material detailed understanding, that we must therefore have a pretty good picture of the whole world. But that's where things start to fall apart, because although it is true that we know details about how the universe is working, we also have many holes in our understanding of how the universe is working. And therefore, our understanding of the world around us is somewhat like Swiss cheese.
Yeah.
We know some things, and there's a hole, and then we know something else, and there's another hole, and we know something else, and there's another hole. And because there's so many holes, we cannot make any real definitive statements about how the real situation of the world is. And one thing that becomes obvious if you study people who reject anything other than a mechanistic, atheistic, scientific explanation, if you study those people, you realize that their explanation only works if they reject many, many phenomena that many people have come across at some point or another. So what you'll discover is that these kind of very mechanistic, atheistic, scientific types, if you ask them, well, what about the soul? They'll say there isn't one. If you ask them what about reincarnation, they say it doesn't exist. What about being able to have ESP? Doesn't exist. What about ghosts? They don't exist. What about aliens? They don't exist. What about the idea of people having past lives and being able to research those? Doesn't exist. So essentially, they've got their police tape, and they've cordoned off all these parts of the reality that many people have maybe sometimes even against their will, discovered that it actually exists. So in other words, their explanation does not explain anything about these phenomena. It's only, the only thing they explain is that it doesn't exist. Where many people have actually experienced it. How many people have had experiences with ghosts or ESP or with, so many different phenomena. So science doesn't explain everything. And this is where we as devotees have to point this out, that the Vedic literatures does have an explanation for these unusual phenomenon that can't just be written off, because scads of people have experienced these things. There's so many things. We've been talking about the whole idea of, Ian Stevenson, who did these investigations of children who remembered past lives. He interviewed them, and then he tried to find out whether the things they said could be corroborated in historical records, and they could be. So this is scientific. But certain kind of scientists will just close the lid on it and say it doesn't exist. So many people have had experiences with UFOs or experiences with various beings that shouldn't be there. And these people are not all crazy. There's like scads and scads of them. And they come up with some very similar things. But what does science do? It just closes the lid on it. This doesn't exist. Similarly, people have demonstrated that there's such a thing as remote viewing, and even common people can do it. It's been demonstrated in laboratories and things like that. But modern science just closes the lid on it. What's that?
What is remote viewing?
Where there was a lab in various places. It started, I think, in California, where someone is asked to try to see what another person is seeing, or in some cases they simply say, here's some coordinates. They give certain, like you have longitude and latitude coordinates. At this coordinate, what do you see? Go there and see it. And they put the person in a electronically sealed off room, so they can't get any kind of electromagnetic information from anything. And some people are better at it than others, but as a result, they were able to see things that are going on somewhere far away, and it can be arbitrarily far away. And it doesn't seem to make any difference whether you're trying to remote view something across the street or something on the opposite side of the planet. It doesn't seem to make any difference at all. The distance has nothing to do with it. And so at first they did this just as test things. They would have a remote viewer, and they would have a subject who would go out somewhere, and the person who would go out somewhere would look at something like a water tower or something like that, and the person remote viewing would say, what is it that they're seeing? And they would draw a sketch of it or give some description of it. And after a while, this began to be quite beyond chance that they would actually understand these things. Eventually the government got interested in this, and they asked them to look, like there was supposedly some big thing happening in Russia. They wanted to know what kind of thing the Russians were building, and with remote viewing they just described it, and so they thought, wait a minute. And that's when the government came in and took the people who were doing it and whisked them all away. And had them, get very good at it, but they said, well, we're shutting this down because it doesn't do anything, But actually, they were totally interested in it, So, at any rate, this kind of stuff is going on. So, in other words, there are many aspects of the world that are part of our everyday life that many people have experienced directly that are not accepted by scientific, dogmatic, mechanistic science, And so, therefore, we say that these things may sound mythological or they may sound fantastic, but we should be a little careful as to how much of the world we really do understand. That the world is bigger and stranger than most people have ever really realized. And so at any rate, that's why I think it's good to be able to have these types of things to discuss, you know. So some people would say telepathy doesn't exist. Some people would say remote viewing doesn't exist. Some people would say that aliens don't exist. Some people would say that reincarnation doesn't exist. But there's evidence of all these things. Not only a little bit, but lots of evidence. And some people would say that in our modern world, we have, you know, all these modern things, but in the past people were, you know, very primitive. But we have things like the pyramids. We couldn't build a pyramid today if we wanted to, but somehow our ancient primitive peoples were able to do it, you know, and there's no explanation given by it, except for they have, you see these pictures of, you know, thousands of slaves pulling a big rock with ropes on some rolling logs, you know. You're going to pull it on rolling logs in the desert? Where do you get the logs, you know? So anyway, you know, there's a number of things that don't add up. And when you start to point the finger at all these different aspects of the world that we live in that don't add up, at least people will come to the understanding that, well, maybe I don't know everything about the way the world works, and maybe what I've always heard in school growing up, maybe some of it isn't as solid as I've been taught that it is, you know. So this is kind of the way or the direction that you can go. Of course, some people will not buy it. What can you do? But at least people who are a little open-minded, it's hard to find someone who is not at some time in their lives run across one of these phenomena somewhere, be it ghosts or reincarnation or remote viewing or ESP or aliens or ancient artifacts that are too advanced to be from primitive people, but nevertheless they're ancient anyway. Very few people have never encountered any of these things, and therefore you can kind of build on whatever it is that the person has encountered and describe that the world is a little bit bigger than some people let on. And so therefore, maybe these things we read about in the Bhagavatam are not so fantastical after all. We know that we are not able to see everything. Now we say that, and the scientists say that. You know, the most recent pronouncement in cosmology is that 97% of the universe is missing. So don't anybody leave the room, you know. We're going to check your pockets. Anyway, so they chalk this up to dark matter and dark energy. So, so the scientists right now, their current theory is that what we actually see when we look out with our telescopes and et cetera, and our radio telescopes as well, all these different sensors, what we actually see is something like 4% of what's actually out there, if their theories are right. Of course, it may be that their theories are off, which is another possibility. But at any rate, scientists accept that there are parts of the universe we cannot see. And, you know, we all know that generally human beings are unable to perceive cosmic rays or X-rays. We can't see atoms. We can't see electromagnetic radiation. We can't see these things, but we accept they exist. So the Vedas are also talking about things that we can't see, but we accept that they exist. And there's some evidence that they exist. So this is how I would gradually work this type of a question or this kind of an issue. Yeah.
Maharaj, I think probably all of us in this room, you were listing off all these different phenomena that I'm sure everyone in this room has experienced deja vu at one point in their lives. And I don't think science has yet to figure out how that occurs. Like how you feel like you've been in a place before, like,
and you wonder how
years ago. been in this exact situation, done the exact same movements, everything just lines up exactly as it played out in your head.
So there's many of these kind of unusual and everyday phenomena that people experience, and it shows the world is stranger than people let on. There's this scientist who does research into this called Rupert Sheldrake, and he talks about, for instance, animals, how sometimes they know when a disaster is coming way before the humans do, and animals can understand that their master is coming home before he does. So how do they know? They didn't get a call from him on the cell phone, so somehow the dog knows that in 15 minutes his master is coming home. How does he know it? And it's a common phenomenon. Lots of people who are pet owners have this kind of thing. Dog, just does random things, and at a certain point he goes right to the door and waits. And so they did tests to have the master come home at unusual times or come home in a different way than they usually do. But far from chance, the animal seems to get it right. How does the animal know? So there's something going on, something that can't be explained in regular, scientific, mechanistic literature. Something else is going on. Some kind of psychic thing is going on between the human and the animal. So there's numbers of those kind of things. And when people start to hear about them, they begin to realize that the Vedas do explain these things, whereas science says nothing about them. And usually the scientific explanation is that they don't exist. That's the explanation. And what kind of an explanation is that? Yeah.
Me and Bhakti Cruz were on a train.
What's that?
Me and Bhakti Cruz is downstairs cooking. We were on one of the subways going to Harinam, and we met this guy on the train. He grows marijuana, and we were just talking to him, and he was saying how he could see over time that, like, if they have like a stack, so they're like really lined up. So like at the start, the front guys, if they got diseased or they got like bacteria or something, they would somehow send a signal to all the other ones, and they would let them know that it's coming, so the other ones wouldn't get affected with that same disease, and they would be able to recover. And he was saying how plants actually they were living entities, and we were talking with him, and then he ended up taking a book. You could accept the philosophy really easily and seeing these phenomena. That was really amazing.
Well, most people have experienced the kind of phenomenon that we're talking about. There's numbers and numbers of it, all kinds of unusual things that happen. And therefore, the first way of getting, this kind of notion across to people is making them aware that although we have all this scientific information, we've got all these colleges with these huge libraries, there's still a lot of stuff that nobody has any explanation for. And science doesn't even look like it's getting close to an explanation. If you ask a scientist, what is consciousness? There's no answer for that question. There's at least 5 completely different theories of what consciousness is, and those theories are not at all compatible. They're completely different theories. So it shows that, some things science can do. They can build an internal combustion engine, they can make a cell phone, they can build a jet plane, they can, build lasers and, CAT scan machines and all these kind of things. They can certainly do these things, but does that mean that because they can do them, they actually understand the universe as a full thing? And the answer is they don't. They can't give any of that kind of thing. And of course, many people, even people who are scientific types, will start to at least follow that reasoning. What's interesting is that recently I've heard that there are now atheistic groups who are totally into meditation. some people who are diehard atheists, but they accept meditation. So you've got all these kind of things happening. So any rate,
they don't call it meditation.
Right, they call
it mindfulness.
Right. There's a way they get around to try to get rid of any religious overtones, but basically we see that people are pragmatic after it all said and done, So, and then we have curses. There's the Hope Diamond curse and things like that, where these things have been around for some time, and people think that curses are just figments of the imagination, but no one person will own the Hope Diamond at this point. It's owned by an organization, because everyone who's ever owned it has died. So what's that?
What is that?
Well, this was a diamond that was one time in a deity in India, and it was stolen by the British. But every person who ever had the diamond as their, personal possession came to ruin or death. And so everybody talked about the Hope Diamond curse. So I think now it's owned by some organization, and no one will actually own it, because it's, there's been too many episodes of anybody ever possessing it coming to some horrible end. So even though it's very attractive and it's, very, prestigious to have something like that, in our modern world where we don't believe in curses, nobody will own it because it's cursed.
Is it like a diamond of a particular deity? Or
yeah, it was.
Which deity?
I don't know. I don't remember the full story on it, but you can Google it.
Okay, man.
There's a number of things like this. There was one time that the government, I forget where, wanted to try to get sailors to stop being superstitious. So they made a boat and called it Friday the 13th. And, they took off on the 13th day of, and, they did everything that was supposedly unlucky. And the sailors were terrified, but they wanted to prove that this was all just nonsense. So the boat left harbor and was never heard of again.
Oh my God. oh my God.
So I mean, and it's very well known that football players and baseball players have their little talismans and things like that, and their little rituals that they do so they win the game. So we live in a world where we believe in science, but still these things are there because people cannot help but recognize that these things that shouldn't work somehow or another have an effect on our world. So is it so hard then to stretch that we have beings that are part of our universe that control what we're doing? Demigods. Is it so hard to stretch with imagination? So that's how I kind of attack this type of mentality, because I don't feel the need to particularly soft pedal any of this stuff. And I think that if you really begin to talk to people, then you can kind of explain why we believe these things and why certainly there's no hard evidence against any of them. Yeah.
Usually when I come across these questions, about when you're shooting books on the streets or something, they, your scriptures say this, that, and the other thing. How can you believe it? You know what? I usually tell this, and maybe you can tell me if it's a bona fide argument, that if 300-400 years ago you told someone there's this thing going to be called the iPhone, and you can just call people up anywhere in the world, and you can take a photo, and they can see what you're doing right here through this device, and you can keep it in your pocket and go anywhere, they'll think you're crazy. Yeah. There's different technologies. So the technology you're using is coming out of iron, but this technology is more subtle. As a technology that they use. So isn't there couldn't you think there's not a possibility of such a technology existing? Are you so ignorant? Is that a bona fide argument?
Yeah, I think it is. there's a verse, there's a line from Shakespeare somewhere that says there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy. So, people just have to have a little bit of chasteness or a little bit of humility to recognize that the world is a bit stranger than most people think it is, and that science certainly hasn't answered every question. There's a lot of questions out there, and Vedas will answer many of those questions, whereas science just cordons them off. They just say that if you talk about it, you're nuts. But people experience them, and that's why people still talk about them. That's why when they have a UFO gathering, people show up. And that's why when people, research these, completely flat cuts in Egypt, that are thousands of years old, they must have been using some kind of a saw, because there's no way a human being with a little chisel could make a perfectly flat surface. It's just not possible. So this is starting to become, really kind of well known in a lot of circles, and as time goes on, more and more people are going to wonder what's up with this, that people in ancient India were using, ancient Egypt were using stone saws of some kind or another, and they must have been better than the ones we have, because the stones that they cut are perfectly, sawed off at right angles. How could they have done that? These are huge stones, and these are ancient stones. And some of the stones have what we call tube saws, where you take something that's like that, and it's got serrated edges, and like a drill, it just cuts a tube hole out of a thing. Now, how could you have possibly done that with a chisel? Because you can't even get your hand down in there. But there are Egyptian statues that are thousands of years old with these kind of tube cuts in them, And so therefore, someone thousands of years ago was using a tube saw, and you can even see the teeth edges on it, and things like that if you look at it. What's the other explanation for that? That means that many, many thousands of years ago there must have been some kind of technology which we would never attribute to primitive people. So at any rate, there's lots of stuff like that. And this is starting to become more and more mainstream. A lot of people are seeing it on YouTube and these places. And you bring it up and you begin to undo the faith that we have in our modern mechanistic, atheistic, very simplistic scientific worldview that has so many holes that we can punch in it, Okay, so, at any rate, that's the short version. Thank you all very much for your attention. All glories to Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, all glories to Vaishnava glories.
Hare Krishna, Chandra Shekhara Swami ki Jai.